Hello, I'm Charles DeBarber, and I'm a beekeeper that loves old bee equipment. But today I'm going to be talking about splits, some of the different types of splits, considerations with splits, even what splits are. Well, today's objectives are simple. We're first going to discuss what a split is, some of the risks and rewards of doing splits. We're going to have to talk about the brood cycle a little bit to understand really how splits occur and the timelines for them. We're going to discuss the conditions required. We're going to discuss spring versus summer splits. We're also going to talk about the different types of splits, which there are three predominant ones. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of each, because each is a double-edged sword. And we're going to talk a little bit about swarming and prevention. A general disclaimer is that there is some great anecdotal data inside of this type of class. My class here is a culmination of best practices. There are things that are anecdotal that I've bumped into, or other beekeepers I've spoken to have bumped into, but I want to point out that some things have good data backing them, and some are just things people say. And it doesn't mean they don't have validity, but I'd be doing you a disservice to treat them the same way. Splits. Well, what is a split? It's more or less when you take the resources of one or more hives and use it to create a new hive. We'll talk about the risks and rewards here. For your risks, communicable disease is one, meaning that your donor hive, if it has European foul brood or American foul brood or some condition, if the bees currently have dysentery, it might not be the greatest thing to pass on over. Furthermore, ambiguous sources of bees are a big deal, especially in states like California and Florida and parts of the American South where Africanized bees are a big problem for them. You want to make sure that you're splitting from hives that, for example, aren't Africanized bees or that. So ambiguous sources from splits can be funny. On top of this, pests. It is a good way to pass pests that are heavy in one place over to another. I've seen it where beekeepers keep multiple yards or get a split from somebody that they know, and it turns out the other yard wasn't treating well for varroa, or it had a lot of hive beetles, for example. And hive beetles love a weak hive like a split because they can really multiply in them. And furthermore, another risk is just wasting resources from failures. You may do a split and it might collapse, it may fail, and then all that brood and resources you took from the donor hive are just lost. So it's a risk and reward there. Some of the rewards, however, chicks dig free bees. Remember that. You want to keep going out and buying packages or nukes all the time. Being able to do a split means that if you have multiple hives, 2 or 3 for the hobbyist beekeeper, let's say 1 or 2 die during winter and you have a living one left, well, you can use it to generate new hives. So, free bees. On top of it, the bees that you have are locally acclimated. When you do your split off of overwintered bees, it means that these bees have overwintered before. They came out healthy and successful. So you know what? They might be better than a package that comes up from Georgia or North Carolina here to Maryland, where we have a little bit of a different climate here. In addition, you have less chance of supersedure when you're doing a split. With packages, they can supersede at a higher rate. I'm told, anecdotally, that certain types of honeybees, such as Russian honeybees, when you either capture their swarm or even do a split with them, they're more likely to supersede on their queen. I don't know how true that is. It's just something I've heard people say. And finally, replacing deadouts, which I explained above. You have some hives die out, and using your living hives, you regenerate the ones that died out. It can save you a lot of money, a lot of pain, a lot of time. Now we have to talk about the brood cycle. The brood cycle is the development stage of honeybees. It's important to know that where your hive is anytime you look at it. Some of the key things that we're checking for when we pop open a hive, of course, has disease and pests. But the number one thing I'm always looking for when I enter the hive is, am I queen right? Meaning, do I have a living laying queen? And what I'm looking for is either her or an egg. An egg tells me that she's been around in the last 24 hours. Now, if I lose her, either because she swarms or she's superseded or whatever occurred, I can look at any current brood in there, and using the brood cycle, I have a pretty good idea of where things are at. Now, if you look in the center of that chart right there for worker, we go from day 1 to day 21 when the new worker emerges. Let's say I don't see any eggs, but I do see some uncapped larvae. Well, that probably means I'm between days 5 and 8, and that the queen's been gone for about 4 days. Okay, I open it up and there's no larva anywhere. Okay, and they're all capped. Well, that tells me that it's at least day 10 since she left, so it's been 10 days. And I can even look and see if workers are emerging, meaning that, okay, it's 21 days since this worker was initially there. So you can have a pretty good clock on when she left. And not only that, you can have a clock that tells you when will the new queen probably start laying again. I have an example here of a calendar I took together for April 2020, in May 2020. Right here on April 1st. Okay, this is the day we do our split, meaning we break off on April 1st. That's the green one. Well, they're going to immediately take those eggs and they're going to start the process of making a queen. They'll make some emergency cells, and they're on day 8, which is purple. That's the day that they're going to cap that cell. Okay, on day 16, the red, that's the day that she's going to emerge. Now remember, during this whole time, we're having bees going out and foraging, and every day we do lose a few bees. So on days 17, 18, and 19, she's just resting. And on April 20th right there, she's going to start doing her mating flights, which can range from a couple of weeks to, honestly, 3 to 4 weeks sometimes, all depending on the season. And we see that blue all the way to May 4th, which we'll call this time was her mating flights. And then on the 5th, the yellow right there, that is the first egg that she lays. Okay, she's not laying now, but during that whole time we've already been losing bees and the hive is getting lower and lower. Well, guess what? The 25th, that's the first day the new workers emerge. So you'll be losing bees for what? Another 2.5 weeks? Remember, during this season, a honeybee typically only lives about 6 weeks. They will literally work themselves to death. So this is the brood cycle here, and during that time when your queen isn't making new bees and new ones aren't emerging, your numbers are declining. These are why with splits you'll want to give them some capped brood. That way they're replenishing their numbers a little bit in that time. It keeps the population steady, because if it gets low enough, it will collapse, especially in earlier parts of the season where it's colder, such as April, where we have some pretty cold nights. If there's not enough bees, they're going to freeze to death. Now, we're going to talk about the conditions required. Now, I have on the right here a picture of 2 different nukes. We have a nice wooden nuke and a nice easy nuke, a plastic one. I'm not saying not to use plastic ones. I'm saying not to use them in April. Because at least here in Maryland, your bees will freeze to death in those things. Get yourself a nice wooden one right there. And when the nights are all above 50, you can transition them over to the plastic container and get them ready to be sold. But use the wooden ones. A lot of the time, I'll start a split off in a deep, and for the splits that I sell, because I do sell a few to replenish our our bee supplies each year and offset the cost of that. But we'll produce about 5-6 nukes a year, and I'll start them out in a deep and then move them over into those white containers. I got pretty deep on that one, huh? All right, the first question you should be asking yourself before you do splits, should I even be doing this? And that's a very good question to ask yourself. Does the donor hive actually have the resources to give up for a split? If they had a really rough winter and they only have begun to start laying and there's not a lot of brood, or a lot of bees for that matter, it doesn't seem like you should be splitting from that one. You need to ask yourself, is this a time of year where drones are flying? Is this a time of year, I'll put it this way, if I don't have a queen laying by late August, they are so boned. I've had some splits take that long that I did much later. I've never had one here in Maryland out of experimental hives that I let try to requeen be able to make a mated queen in September here in Maryland. I would avoid it in general. You need to ask yourself, what time of year is it? Are there drones even flying? I had an occasion where the queen died in early March, and by the time I got to it, it was a laying worker situation, but they did have plenty of bees. What happened there is the hive got blown over because they get very top heavy that time of year. I got it back together, but I lost the queen. She must have got squished between frames or something. Because I had a laying worker situation that quickly, I didn't think I'd talk them out of it, so I just merged them with another colony, one that was a little bit bigger and more robust, that had a laying queen, and made myself a bit of a Hivezilla. And they produced an insane amount of honey, and around, I think, July 4th, I just split them back into 2 hives. Like, too easy. Just because you merge doesn't mean you can't split later. Just keep that in mind. You need to ask yourself, are these healthy bees? If these guys, you open it up and there's a lot of malformed wing virus and things like that indicating varroa in that, you may not have healthy bees. If there's diarrhea on the front of the hive, you might have some issues here. I wouldn't use those bees. You also want to ask yourself, is it the right time of year? As I said before, if it's too late or too early, this isn't your time. And just for Maryland, now remember, every region changes, but in Maryland, you can start doing your splits the first week of April, and the latest I would do one, honestly, is about mid-July. That's the latest I would do one. I try to do my summer splits around July 4th here. And then finally, do I even have nurse bees? Because you need a significant amount of nurse bees moved over, which are very young bees. It's the first job that bees do when they're born. They go in and they feed the larvae and clean cells, and they take care of things more or less. They are a very critical part of every single split, and you can't tell them by eye who are the nurse bees, but you'll find them on broody frames. If you got a frame, has open eggs in it, there's nurse bees on it. You also need to ask, do I have the equipment needed? Do I have a hive to even put the split in? Because you're going to need some to put it in. Is that hive adequate for the temperature? Which we gave the example on the right there, that the top one is a really good one to use in April here in Maryland because of the cold nights. Well, the plastic one will do just fine for a summer split in July. You ask yourself, do I have a feeding solution for them that'll work during this time of year? The 2 key ones are, do I have a way of giving them sugar syrup? Which, an easy nuke, they have a special feeder you have to buy for that. For a traditional nuke, you can just pop a Boardman in there, because you don't want to put a frame feeder in because you have such little space already. But you have to have a way of feeding them. A lot of the time, when I have hives that pass away, I'll keep at least 1 deep and a medium of honey. I then use those over on my nukes, and I'll use them for my splits as well. That way I don't have to pop in and feed them, and they already start out with some resources. And you got to ask yourself, do I have an entrance reducer? Because it both keeps out cold and it'll defend them from robbers. And if they're in a bee yard with a lot of other hives might be pretty quick to try to rob them, especially during more dire parts of the year like autumn. So making sure you have an entrance reducer handy to reduce the size of the entrance and help them defend it better, that's ideal. It's all in the prep. I make that piece of advice whenever I do swarms, catches, and I'll say it here. It's all in the prep. I would say prepare all your equipment right there is a very important one. Lay all your stuff out before you do it. Don't be running back and forth to your shed. It's just not the time of year to do that, and the bees are already getting a little irritated with me popping in there and taking stuff. So, prepare your stuff, lay it out, have everything ready and on hand. Make sure to choose your donor hives beforehand. When you do prepared splits, I can honestly say I try to choose them beforehand and know who, but I bump into a lot of situations, and you'll see, especially later with a type of split called a queen cell split, I get surprised by these things just like any other beekeeper. And there are moments of, wow, I really need to split this hive, which is why number 3 is really important. Be prepared for surprises with additional equipment. Always have an extra nuke on hand. Always have another hive on hand. Always have additional equipment on hand because swarms happen, because you may need to do emergency splits because stuff's going to happen, and Amazon isn't going to get it to you fast enough. Running down to your beekeeping shop, you're not going to get that equipment together, painted, and out in time to deal with these situations. Have it on hand, or at least have somebody you can call that's dependable that has extra equipment that can work with you, and work out these arrangements beforehand. With these, try to find the queen. At least make sure you don't accidentally take her. I'm embarrassed to say I've done it a couple times now where I've accidentally taken the queen and moved her over to the new colony, which is a type of split we'll talk about. That's called the donor queen split. It's not the worst thing in the world, but you know, if you don't want to do a donor queen split, don't do it. Look for the queen. Make sure you know where she is. Don't accidentally donate her if you don't mean to. Now, the resources that splits need are the same resources that all bees need. You need food, which in this form is honey or sugar syrup. Put a little honey in there, honestly. It makes things easier, and it may reduce robbing. I've read time and time again, Boardman feeders encourage robbing, and that's something people say. I haven't seen a study on it. Somebody can submit one to me and show me, okay, they definitely do. It's just something I've heard people say, but I haven't seen data behind it. So I have to call that anecdotal right now. But if you're more or less keeping them in the hive when you have some honey in there, and keeping them doing other jobs and doing less foraging. You need to be aware of fermentation, especially for those of us that use some resources from dead hives to move over to the new hives. Uncapped honey, uncapped nectar that was being processed into honey, it never got to the right water content, which is 17%. So over winter, it probably is fermented, and you can smell it when you open the hive. You can smell that fermented smell. You probably want to avoid giving that to a split. You can cause dysentery, and you'll see bee diarrhea on the front. It's not great. It may not kill your hive, but it can set them back. Remember, honey also provides good insulation. For my spring splits, especially before the nights are all above 50 degrees, I will put a frame of honey on both sides of the 5 frames, and that provides solid insulation. I might take it back at some point if I don't feel they have enough laying room later when the nights are above 50. But that honey is solid insulation, and you need to keep these guys warm, especially for spring splits. Now, pollen, they do need it. You can give them a small chunk of a pollen patty. Don't give them a whole pollen patty, ever. because hive beetles really explode in population with those things. You can also give them a frame that has some on it. Either works. Just make sure they got some pollen because they're going to need it for brood eventually. For brood, make sure you give them eggs, which if you see the picture on the bottom, there's eggs in the center on the right. There's that little flick of rice. If you give them pupa like you see on the right there, they can't turn those into queens. For walk-away splits, this is very paramount. They need eggs. If they don't have eggs, they can't make a queen. I also give them some capped as well. That way their population stays up. Because during that time, the capped ones will emerge and join the population. Another good thing to keep in mind. Give them some capped. Now, we're going to talk about, before we talk about the different types of splits, we're going to talk about spring and summer splits. These necessarily aren't types of splits. They're just two different times to do them, more or less. And each has pros and cons. With the spring split, you have more time to develop and build their hive. And remember, spring splits are from April to mid-June. Another thing to keep in mind is donor hives for spring splits do impede honey conditions. I don't know why I have that written down as pro. That's a typo. But remember, your donor hive, it is being set up. I don't want to say set up for failure, but it's being impeded because you're taking some of their population away that may be very critical during the nectar flow. So it might impede your honey crop. Spring splits, they can build their own food stores more efficiently, meaning I might not have to pump them full of food or donate a significant amount of food to them later in fall to overwinter them. And another good pro is that it might deter swarming. Doing a split in a very crowded hive might deter them from swarming, which will save you a lot of heartache about the time that the nectar flow comes, because 40 to 60% of your bees didn't leave with the queen. For summer splits, which are mid-June to the end of July, these splits can be made after the key nectar flows and won't impede your hives. The nectar flow, at least for this region, the major one, is done. And they have so much to give, which is the second pro. After the nectar flow, they have a lot of extra bees, a lot of extra brood, a lot of extra resources. It's a great time, especially because the hives, when they enter nectar dearth, they may be a little touchier during that time, but they got a lot of extra bees to give. So that's a great time to take them. On top of it, you have ideal weather. They're not going to freeze to death at night. You're also going to be out of the rainy spring season, meaning that the queen is probably going to start laying faster because there's less rainy days. Once again, you could have bad luck, but that's typically how it is. A con here is that oh my goodness, did I jump to the other list? Pardon me. No, okay, we'll continue here. A con is that they need to be able to produce enough winter bees. Winter bees are produced for the most part in August and September. These are bees that are going to carry them through winter, and they need really healthy winter bees. So if during summer your new queen is pumping out new workers and keeping the population up and giving lots of new bees, that's going to be a big issue. On top of it, you're going to have to feed them and donate resources for them to survive winter. They've missed the key nectar flow, and here in Maryland we do have a small one in fall as well with goldenrod, but it'd be foolhardy to say, okay, this is all they need. I'd be giving them honey from the other hives and probably pumping them full of food, and even maybe a sugar cake and some fondant on top of it. And then remember too that varroa and other pests are at their height at that time of season, meaning if you move over, you're probably going to treat for varroa with a very light treatment, so you don't kill too many bees. But at that time of year, there's a lot of varroa in your hive. The first type of split we're going to talk about is the walkaway split. Now, a walkaway split is when you have a hive that is established without a queen using fresh eggs and a healthy number of worker bees. Typically when I do these, I'll take 2 deep frames of brood and make sure that they're just covered in worker bees. Those are your nurse bees. Excuse me, those are your nurse bees there. I'll also include another frame of worker bees that I'll just shake in and then put the frame back in the donor hive. You got to make sure that at least on one of those brood frames you have eggs. The other can be mostly capped brood. You got to make sure that you have at least 3 deep frames worth of bees inside of that split there for it to work. The pros of this method, the donor hive does not need to give up its queen, meaning that your donor hive can just keep producing and doing its thing. You do get a new fresh queen in the split because they start generating their own. And it's easier to make multiple splits from a single donor hive. A lot of the time, you'll say, let's say I produce a certain amount of honey, and I have 20 hives in the garden. I may decide, okay, I'm going to have 2 of these be donor hives to make splits, and the rest of them will be my honey producing hives. So you'll get your multiple splits from those donor hives. So I don't need to go, let's say I want to make 6 splits. Well, a couple of those can probably give me 3 apiece if it's a big healthy enough colony, as opposed to spreading that out through my hives. You really got to look at it because it's a double-edged sword. What are my cons? Well, the brood cycle for this makes it more likely that the first bees will emerge around 50 days later, which can be, honestly, that can be your whole nectar flow, frankly. So it takes the longest. The hive will also need more worker bees. You're going to have to give it more worker bees or a significant amount of capped brood because, once again, it's not going to have the first adult bee merging until at least 50 days from then. And you're going to have a significant attrition rate, especially for your spring bees and your spring splits, because those bees, once again, they only live 6 weeks. They are more prone to failure by chance, and what I mean by that is that sometimes you just get unlucky. Like the 2020 spring season here in central Maryland, April was just unseasonably cold. There were only 2 to 3 days where there was good queen mating weather, where the temps were high enough and it wasn't raining. So there were a lot of splits that just collapsed. I've never had that many collapse before as I did that year, but it was just bad luck. You'll also have it to where you might have 2 weeks of rain where it rains all day and the queens just can't get out there and mate. Things happen. You might get an unseasonably cold snap at one time and you just didn't happen to have enough workers to keep that hive warm. Sometimes your queen out on her mating flights might get eaten by a bird. Sometimes you just get unlucky. And with these walkaway splits, because 1, it's a virgin queen, and 2, just stuff can happen over that period. There's more opportunities for bad stuff to happen. Does it mean it happens most of the time? No. Usually I get 4 out of 5 hives successfully mated. And that's in most years. There are plenty of years I get 5 out of 5. Last year I got 3 out of 5 because of the situation with the weather. The second type of split is the capped queen split. Now, a capped queen split is when a new hive is established with capped queen cells and a healthy number of worker bees. This split is really common in late April and during the month of May. That's because of swarming. Like at that time, they're swarming, and you may pop open your hive and discover, oh damn, there's either capped queen cells or there are queen cells that they've laid an egg in. Well, damn. I guess they're going to start making queens now. This can also be done artificially by moving the queen out of the hive and making her make these swarm cells. And as I said, it occurs with swarming donor hives a lot of the time. Now, typically, it's not different from the other. I'll give them 3 deeps worth of worker bees. I'll give them at least 2 frames with brood, 1 with capped and 1 with eggs. Now, the cool part about this is you got to think back to that brood cycle, to where if you're giving capped queen cells, they're at least 7 days. That means that that queen is at least 7 days old. That takes a solid week out of when you may see bees. And you'll see over in the cons there, instead of 50 days, you'll probably see your first bees emerging in 40 days. 10 days is a real big difference during a nectar flow, or honestly during your season, because once again, it makes a big difference, especially with the attrition rate of bees. Now, your pros for these are the donor hive does not need to give up its queen. It does not need to give up its queen to do this. But once again, typically they're making these because the queen has left or about to leave. Fun fact, and this is a little bit of a tangent, it's pretty common when you watch your hives this time of year, especially through April and May, you may catch her about to swarm. You'll open it up and you'll see that they did indeed lay in the swarm cells, but she's still there. There are people with the philosophy of crush the queen cells and maybe she'll stay. Well, she might, but you're betting against yourself. What you should do is you should take the queen and then 2-3 frames of brood, move them over to a box with that 2-3 frames worth of bees, and just establish them in another box. That way you get to keep her, and then you can harvest these great capped cells, and hopefully they're spread out on a bunch of different frames, and try to put about 3 capped cells per hive, at least 2. But like 3 is ideal because sometimes these things can fail. Now back on the main point here. Now the donor hive doesn't need to give up its queen, and you once again get a fresh queen. That's a great pro, as opposed to the third kind of split we'll talk about where you don't donate a queen. It is easier to make multiple splits. Multiple splits from a single hive. Because they're making multiple cells. Once again, try to get at least 3 cells per split. Some of these hives, I've seen as many as 18, 19 queen cells before in a single hive on multiple tiers. Some of these hives can be very, very generous. It cuts at least a week off of the brood cycle. Now, that all depends on when you get to it. We're going to say that as a capped queen split, you're getting it when it's capped at day 7. But remember, it can be as old as 15 days before that queen emerges. So you could cut almost 2 weeks off. So you could make it even shorter than 40 days, frankly. It could be closer to 33 days before you see your first bee. All depends on how old the capped cell is. Now, over in cons, you need the right conditions, meaning the queen needs to get swarmy, or you need to artificially make it happen. You'll see with our next one where you donate a queen, you could do one of those splits where you donate a queen, and then with these new cells that are being generated, you can have the donor hive produce these cells and then make additional splits off of that. That's what a lot of folks do. But that's just another option. You do need multiple queen cells as a fail-safe, as I said. Try to go for at least 3. Two will work, sometimes one will work, but sometimes these cells are duds. It happens plenty of it happens plenty more times than you'd think. And still, it is a significant wait for firstborn bees, but if you got it on the day they cap the earliest, it'll be about 40 days. It could be as small once again as 33, because you can cut another 7 days off there, depending on the age of that cap cell. Now the third is the donor-queen split. A donor-queen split is when a new hive is established with a mated queen and worker bees. Now, this is where you're giving the queen of one hive over to a split. And typically you'll still give them 3 frames of worker bees. You'll also give them a little bit of capped brood, because remember now it's going to take them 21 days to get the first workers. And that'll help keep the brood cycle stable as the new queen starts laying. To be frank, like these are the most successful splits, but you'll see in the cons. This, I'd argue, a donor queen split doesn't count if you buy a queen elsewhere and move in and give it to a split. That's a whole different thing. We're only talking about splits that come from the resources right in your own bee yard. But that is an option too. You could purchase a queen and bring her in and do that. And some people like that as a way of introducing new genetics to their bee yard, because perhaps their bees are a little too closely related. And they just want to get more genetic diversity in the bee yard. For your pros, the queen is laying on day 1 and your first bees are going to emerge in 21 days. It is by far the fastest split. I've accidentally made these a few times but when I tried to do a walkaway and accidentally gave the queen. And I have made them on purpose sometimes. They are the most prone to success because they immediately start with a queen, and it's just because you eliminate some of the threat factors that exist for them. Bad luck isn't going to affect them so much. Like bad weather isn't going to prevent her going on mating flights. She's not going to get killed on mating flights. You don't have to worry about duds occurring in the hive. You don't have to worry about 2 new queens being born and then accidentally mortally wounding each other. You're eliminating a whole bunch of factors that just now don't exist that are risks. So they are the most prone to success, and they're less likely to collapse on themselves because the brood cycle isn't as brutal on them. And then finally, the process of the hive making new queens can lead to additional capped queen cells, which you can then make more capped queen splits with. So this can begot better quality splits than a walkaway split, or at least typically more successful ones. The con is, each hive has but 1 mated queen to give, and the minute you give her up, that may make problems for you if you're trying to get honey out of that particular hive that year. On top of it, the donor hive has to make a new queen, which now slows down that hive's development at a critical time, especially in spring. But I will say this, though. The donor hive is often in the best place to generate a new queen, much better than a split is. They have the resources, they have the bees. It often doesn't leave... The brood cycle doesn't leave as cruel an impact on them usually. It all depends on how much they had to give in the first place. But typically, they can replace better than a split can. Now, you have unlucky moments, as I said. If a newly emerged queen has not started laying after 20 days, it is likely doomed. You'll start seeing laying workers, and they'll tell you that the hive is collapsing. This could mean because she's just taken too long to lay, or she got ate by a bird. Um, Maybe you just had a marginal queen. These things happen. On the right, you'll see pictures of these open cells with just hordes of eggs in them. That is a laying worker situation. Those are all drone eggs, and if you have that problem, honestly, just merge them with a much larger colony and do a newspaper merge, and just start anew. You don't have to waste those bees that are left, and you can put them in a stronger hive. They'll police up the laying worker situation and set you up for success. Um, Remember that cold springs are harsh on splits. As I said, the April 2020 season only had 4 to 5 days of queen mating temperatures. It led to many split collapses in the region, and I sincerely think it was more like 2 or 3 days, frankly. But I never had so many splits collapse, and the ones I did have that were successful took another week and a half to 2 weeks to finally get mated. Sometimes you'll have excessive daytime rain that can impact queen mating, especially in spring. Um, there are areas that just don't have enough drones. There are more or less like these islands that exist out there in certain areas around you that there's just not great drone congregation areas for mating. It'll either take longer. It's no fault of yours. You're just kind of boned where you are there. And then finally, your walkaway split or cap queen split bleed numbers through cast swarms. Cast swarms, also known as virgin swarms, are when on one side of the hive the queen emerges and she comes out, and the first thing queen does is she starts killing all the other queens in their queen cells. Well, maybe she emerges and some bees defect to her, and then on the other side of the hive in another box, a queen emerges over there and some bees defect to her. So eventually, one or more of these emerging queens are going to form a cast swarm, and they're going to leave. So they'll leave, and you'll get these usually smaller swarms that have multiple queens in them sometimes that are virgin queens. It's not lucky, especially for some of these splits, because you just lost a significant number of bees, and it makes them a little bit more prone to collapse. It happens. It sucks. If you catch them, sometimes you can merge them back in. But it's what it is. Swarms, which I give another class that you can find on my YouTube channel here, that talks specifically about it. And this one was stolen from that one. Swarms are sometimes those splits that you really didn't want to happen, but if you can catch them, you can keep them, and it's more or less like a donor queen split. When they do swarm, they take about 40 to 60% of the bees typically, and these swarms will come in different sizes. And as I say in here, and as I talk about in my swarms cutouts and bait boxes class, don't break your neck getting to them. Bees are not worth getting up on a ladder and hurting yourself. Be careful, because they can be in some dangerous, especially some dangerously high places. Don't be foolhardy in your capture of them. And you'll see some things I cover in my class and safety tips that can help. You may ask yourself, why would a swarm settle in this really weird place? Why did they choose this particular bush in front of my house? Well, it's because it's what they chose. You'll see in here they chose the back of a car, which can obviously move. The bottom of a bench. I've caught them on the bottom of lawn chairs before, or on the bottom of grills or tables and lawn furniture. I've caught them in trees, hanging on branches. I've found them on the ground, which often indicates that the queen might be injured and she's having difficulty flying. Those are what I playfully call ground swarms. They do tend to like to be high up, so they tend to be about 10 feet up on the ground or higher. meaning that a ladder or some type of net might be, oh, pardon me, your solution to that. It's good to have something on hand, either a ladder or some type of modified pool net. Like the guy on the bottom left has a really neat device that he made with more or less a pool net stick, which those things can go up to 16 to 20 feet, and a bottom half of, excuse me, the top half of a old office water tank. Just that and some duct tape, and he has a neat device where he can more or less shake a swarm into it, bring it down, and dump it into the hive. On top of it, you know, some of these things have multiple queens. Those cast swarms we talked about, you may find multiple queens in them. Just catch them, put them all together, and eventually they'll figure that situation out. Somebody's either going to get superseded or murked by the other queen, but they'll figure that out among themselves. And you know, what do you need to catch them? Well, first of all, you do need a way to get to them. Often a ladder, often a really neat modified pole like that. There are a few times I've even stood on the back of my truck bed, and I was able to get truck access to get to them. You need something to put them in, meaning, you know what? In a dire situation, you could shake them into a cardboard box and then bring them to a hive and dump them in. But at least when I drive around this time of year, I have at least one hive in the back of my vehicle ready, because I'm a local swarm catcher. They're not going to catch me by surprise. Always have extra equipment. Always have an extra nuke box or an extra deep with a top cover and bottom. That way you can catch these guys when they occur. Because I'll put it this way, when a swarm kicks off, Amazon's not going to get that equipment to you in time. You really need to just have something on hand. It's also great to network with other beekeepers, because you might be able to call and say, hey, I got a swarm, could I borrow some equipment for a few days until the new stuff arrives. On top, another thing to catch them is patience. You'll see below I say bait is right there. Your strategy with swarms is just shake them into a box. If you get the queen, they'll follow. And then you can often come get them at night and then move to the proper location, because they'll all be in there at night if they don't abscond. But just be patient. Sometimes you'll shake them down and you didn't get the queen and the rest of them will fly back up. Sometimes you'll put them in a box, especially some of the nuke boxes that people use, and they'll decide, I don't like this, and they'll abscond right there. And then you have to catch them again. You know, just be patient. You're working with them, and they have a hive mind of their own. And if they abscond from a box, maybe you should probably use a different box. My abscond rate dramatically dropped when I just switched to deeps. Is my box, because frankly my homemade 5 and to 7 frame little nukes just weren't doing it. Finally, you know what really helps? Bait. And what I mean by bait is using either lemongrass or Swarm Commander. I put a dot in the back of the hive on the top of the 2 middle frames. I'll also put a dot in the back of the hive on the bottom board, and I'll put 1 dot at the front of the hive at the entrance. Some people will put a dab on a Q-tip, wipe those 4 areas, and then drop the Q-tip into the hive. I don't do that because that's more of a bait hive situation. But you know, it doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt. Now we're entering the anecdotal zone. These are going to be a lot of best practices or things that I've heard and things that I've said. So take these with a grain of salt, but I do think they're useful. You know, for swarm prevention, splitting strong colonies before they swarm is a popular tactic, and this does help. This does indeed help, and there is data behind this one. But it is limited data. Walkaway splits, they can uncrowd a donor colony. they can make it to where, especially if you swap out especially if you swap out brood comb for some empty drawn frames, now they have more space to use, and now they might be a little less swarmy. Capped queen splits do prevent cast swarming. What some people do, at least with their hives, is they limit the number of swarm cells. If they have like 10, they'll crush 7 of them. That way, there's only 3 possible queen cells to emerge. It reduces the number of cast swarms that they'll get. Furthermore, donor queen splits can simulate a smaller swarm and prevent a significantly larger one. You'll get in there, as I said, you'll see mama's about to leave, and instead of 40 to 60% of the bees leaving with her when she goes, move her over to a different box, bring about, once again, maybe 3 frames of bees. Maybe it's really like 10% of the hive to 15% really, and you're moving that on over. That's going to save you, one, losing your queen, and then 40 to 60% of the bees in that hive. But now you generated a second hive that's going to immediately start laying. That simulation, it'll save you a lot of heartache. Furthermore, some people will cage their queen to break the brood cycle and impede growth in late April, early May. They'll decide, I have more than enough bees right now, and more than enough bees coming for the nectar flow, so I'll cage her for a few days and kind of break the brood cycle, and that'll have her lay a little bit less. I haven't done it. I know it's a tactic that people do use in this region and others. So once again, take it with a grain of salt. It sounds like in theory it does what it's supposed to do. On top of it, donating brood and nurse bees to weaker colonies in late April, early May, that is a solid tactic that I have used before. Once again, when I swap frames back, I'll give the donating colony empty frames that are drawn. Just frames that are drawn and ready to have stuff put in them. And normally I'll take it from the weaker colony. It's a great way of empowering one colony while lowering the population of another one, or at least impeding it to prevent them from being swarmy. I really think it's a great direction to go, because you're not wasting those resources. You're just kind of moving them over to somewhere and making a stronger colony that potentially can be a lot more solid in gathering nectar. Early spring box rotating is a very common, early spring box rotating based on the current location of the brood chamber. Move empty boxes to the top. Now this is just rotating your boxes in the season. Now bees are sort of like a fire in that they move upward. They put resources upward typically. They will eat themselves upward when they start in autumn, and they'll gradually move their brood chamber and everything upward as they eat. That means usually the bottom boxes won't be occupied, or at least the bottom box. Take a look, see where your brood chamber is in your hive, and if your bottom's empty, just move it to the top. It is a good tactic, because it's not likely that she's going to go down and start laying down there. It's more likely she's actually going to move upward. So this is a good tactic. It is pretty universally accepted among beekeepers. I haven't seen numbers on it, so I'm in the anecdotal zone, but I would believe that this works. There are some beekeepers, I said, that do squash queen cells. They do this to prevent cast swarms and limit the number of queen cells, as I said. And you know what? It might talk a queen out of leaving, but as I said, you're betting against yourself when you do it. Let's say you crush those cells and she leaves anyway. Now they're going to maybe make some emergency queens. Maybe they won't make any. And then you're just boned. You'll have to move over fresh brood from another colony to get things started up again. And then you'll lose that queen and her bloodline in the process. I'll put it this way: it's never worth crushing to get her to stay. It's not worth it. You're betting against yourself. Like I would say, even if it worked 70% of the time, that's still not good enough to work. Because if you're boned 30% of the time, that's just too often. One of my mentors actually said it best that he told me, "Hey Charles, crushing those cells and trying to get her to stay. When she makes her mind up, she's just going to go, and that's what she's telling you when she puts the eggs in there. It's a lot like a very indecisive wife. Maybe she's going to stay, maybe she's going to go." I'm sorry, I'm just chuckling thinking about that. There's also this other method, the DeMarie method, which I might be pronouncing wrong. Basically, the beekeeper separates the queen from most of the brood, and they'll manipulate the frames and use a queen excluder. That way, the hive is simulated to be congested, and it leaves a lot of room for the queen to lay. So in essence, the hive believes it has already swarmed because of how it's done. This is an old method. The earliest mentions of it look around 1917-ish, going back to the Great War. It's still utilized. I know it appears in modern bee literature. I don't know enough about it to talk much about it. I can just say that it's popular, and it's an old method that's been around for a long time. So once again, research it and see if it's something that you might want to experiment with. Well, this is typically my question and answer section. I wanted to brag about the picture there. That is a hive I rescued with some assistance from Bolton Hill Park in Baltimore. That was the elbow of a tree that was about 30 feet up off the ground there that broke. And I came out at night and helped rescue that hive. I had to cut all the branch pieces and haul it to the garden. You can see the wheelbarrow behind it that night where I dragged them in. And I brought all 3 pieces in and cut it out and saved that hive. And sadly, the queen in it got squished because by the time I got to it, they were already drawing emergency queen cells. But they survived, and they're a thriving hive that I've made quite a few splits from. And that was 2 years ago. So these guys are now, I think this bloodline is continued with about 6 different hives, and they're a very great locally acclimated bee. And I love catching swarms and getting a lot of these locally acclimated bees. And they're some of the ones I love to split. The only other piece of advice I'd give is make sure you take very good notes. As we discussed back there with the calendar, you really need to keep a calendar when you're doing splits. In fact, when you're doing beekeeping, I would recommend at least using something like Google Calendar. Mark in there, okay, visited hive 1 through 5, inspected, these are queen right. Hive 7 wasn't queen right. Then you can do your count with the brood cycle and figure out when should I start seeing eggs again. When is my panic time if I'm not seeing eggs, meaning I really should merge this with another colony. But when you're doing splits, this tells you when you should be looking at things. And that's what I would do, especially if you sell a couple splits, because one of the ways that you can offset the costs of beekeeping, frankly, is by, frankly, selling bees. You can make some splits off your colony, sell them, and that'll pay for your varroa treatments and equipment maintenance and new frames and new foundation. It's a pretty nice way to keep carrying it. Furthermore, you can make splits that you just donate to community gardens and other organizations that can put them to use. So once again, keep a calendar, keep good notes. It's really pivotal to the success of a successful split. And one more cute calendar thing. I have a hive that I shook out of a tree 6 years ago in Annapolis. Great bees, they are the parent to probably 60% of my hives in my bee yard. So I have more than 10 hives that have that are a relative of that original hive from all those years ago. They're great bees, they're very dependable bees, but I've noticed, because I've taken notes for 5 years, they swarm sometime between April 9th and April 15th every year. They're a very early swarm. There's something genetic about them because almost every one of their hives do it around that time. That tells me, because I keep good notes, that I should be checking the first week of April for them, and I can catch them doing it, meaning I can make splits around that time. You can find that some bees and their close relatives, they may have a time that they just seem to swarm, or typically swarm in your particular region. So pay attention to those notes and look at your calendar routinely and figure those things out. I know that they're going to swarm around that time, and I'm going to be able to pull really quite a few nice splits from them. All right, well, feel free to leave any questions down in the comments, and I hope you all have a wonderful season. I know I'm very excited about it. Have a good one, and good night.